Much, Lance. Please stick around. It's really a great honor for me to introduce our first speaker. I've had the pleasure of traveling with Bill and his lovely wife, Connie. He is an outstanding birder, and we're really lucky to have him here today as our speaker. Bill worked as a naturalist and wildlife educator for Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources at the Horicon Marsh for 27 years, where he conducted more than 3,700 educational programs for over 220,000 people. His broad audience includes 66 delegations of scientists from 43 countries who came for professional training. In his personal time, he has traveled widely in search of the world's birds and the wild places they inhabit. And he just got back from Bolivia, so we haven't even heard his stories about that yet. His travels have taken him through Central and South America, across the Canadian Arctic, to Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, and Mongolia. Bill has been watching and studying birds for over 40 years, and in his travels has sighted more than 2,500 species, 1/4 of the world's birds. To facilitate his studies, he is also a federally licensed bird bander and with the bird banding laboratory of the U.S. Geological Survey. It's with great pleasure, Bill, that we have you here today, and it takes him normally 2 hours to get here, but it took 3.5, so a big round of applause to start.
Well, thank you, Sharon, and thank you everyone else for taking your time out of a snowy spring day like this to join us. As Sharon mentioned, yes, I just got back 2.5 days ago from Bolivia. We were traveling for 2 months. I'd led a birding tour in Nicaragua, where I've been working since 2002, and then in no sense coming home in between that, and another tour I helped co-lead in Bolivia, so we traveled around Peru during that time. It was always nice to get away, especially during our winter, and not only to see some exotic wildlife, but of course to see a lot of our so-called summer birds down in the wintering grounds. So we always bring back a lot of interesting experiences and memories, and I'm glad to be here today because I brought back something else which is still living in my digestive tract. I spent an evening in an emergency room in Bolivia, which was another unique experience. A couple more doses of antibiotics, they said I'll get over that as well. Souvenir I guess I didn't want. If I gave you that number of over 2,500 species of birds that I've sighted, I need to update that. That's out of date. Actually, I just tallied up as of this most recent trip. It's over 3,750 species of birds that I've sighted now, which also means that there's more than 2/3 of the world's birds I haven't seen. So still a lot of travel to do. And while there's birds in so many different places, I'm always reminded that, we have our own community of birds that we're responsible for, and as much as I enjoy going to exotic places to see something totally new of wildlife, what I've oftentimes found fascinating is when I meet other birders in different corners of the world, I hear from a lot of them, oh gosh, I want to come to the United States. I'd love to see your wood warblers. I'd love to see some of the different families of birds that you have that we can't find anywhere else. So as much as we sometimes think about conservation issues of wildlife in other places, they're just as urgent here back home. And certainly one of the groups of birds that are very much threatened by land conversions are the grassland birds. And prairie chickens, like so many others, are dependent upon that. So I want to talk a little bit about the conservation of those grassland birds and their habitats. Now, first of all, grasslands are kind of a unique community because they're a transition between forests and deserts. Where we have sufficient moisture throughout the year, we tend to find some pretty abundant forest types that are growing, and as environments become much more stressed and limited in the amount of rainfall, we'll get to the extremes of deserts. Grasslands lie between. They're not that dry where they can't support much life and become a full desert, but there are times of the year with minimal rainfall, and so the grasses tend to dominate. And so we really find this transition, and if you go from the eastern United States down to the southwest, you've got to cross the prairies before you get into those deserts. And that's true of so many different places in the world. So it's your unique kind of climatic conditions that lead to grasslands, and they're found in just about every continent in the world. Here's a map of the major grasslands that we'll find around the world. North America, South America, throughout Africa with its savannas and grassland, and across Eastern Europe, stretching through in Georgia, the steppes of Eastern Europe, and of course the grasslands of Mongolia. Also in Australia, there are desert grasslands, as well as the central deserts within the interior portion of the continent. Take a little tour of some of the different grassland communities around the world. One I think is familiar to a lot of people are the Argentine Pampas. And this is that large stretch of grassland reaching inland from Buenos Aires. And this is a very large community that is certainly under pressure of different kinds of land conversions these days. Here we see the greater rhea as one of the birds found out there. We're using pampas grass as an ornamental these days around a lot of landscapes. This is where they're found. And as you travel from there toward the Andes, things start to dry out before you get a little higher into the moist areas. And so there again, that transition of going from the grasslands into that true desert community and then reaching up into the mountains. As you travel a little farther north, you get into the tropical rainforest. Of course, remember that Venezuela is south of the equator, so as you get north in that country, you're getting to the tropical zone. And so here we're seeing that transition, moving one side into the full desert, going farther north, you reach into the rainforest. This is Iguazu Falls. One of the very well-known expansive grasslands in East Africa, the Serengeti. Again, another area that is well south of the desert areas of the Sahara and north of the Kalahari. Supporting huge herds of grazing animals. This is still a fairly intact community, but again, that also is under increasing pressure from intensified grazing and conversions. As you travel to the south, you get into the Kalahari Desert itself, so we see a decrease in moisture, and the grasslands tend to more or less disappear, giving way to a true desert community. You go in the other direction, we get up into the tropical zone where the forests start to dominate. So this is wedged right between those shifting climatic zones. This is Victoria Falls. And then in Central Asia, you have expansive grasslands. Mongolia and steppes cover huge areas south of Russia. Mongolia is about the same size as Alaska, 1,000 miles across, almost 700 miles north and south, and the vast majority of that is a grassland community. As you head further south, things become more stressed. You get into the Gobi Deserts. That's my wife on a camel ride there. As you go in the other direction, heading north, we get into the edge of the Siberian taiga. So rather than a broadleaf forest, most of this is the coniferous forest or boreal forest of Russia. So these grasslands are very unique geographic and biogeographic communities around the world, and because of their limited moisture, people have used them primarily for grazelands rather than agriculture. Since they don't have enough moisture throughout the year to support trees, they also don't have an awful lot of moisture for crop growing. So grazing has oftentimes been the major use for these lands throughout the world. In the United States, our grassland are the Great Prairies. And the prairies essentially form the whole mid-portion of the North American continent, from south central Canada all the way into Texas. The prairies themselves formed as a result of the uplift of the Rocky Mountains. When you watch your evening weather report, we're always looking out west to see what kind of weather is going to be reaching Wisconsin in a couple of days. So our weather systems are moving west to east. So as that Pacific moisture is being gathered up by the weather systems coming into the continent, that uplift and rise of the Rocky Mountains traps that moisture on the west side, which is of course why those coastal areas get such high amounts of fog and rain throughout the year. They lose a lot of that moisture, and then as it finally makes its way over the Rockies, they've dried out tremendously. As the weather systems continue to move toward the Midwest, particularly during summer, we see more of our weather and the moisture associated with it coming up from the Gulf Coast. Along the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains, average rainfall is about 9 to 11 inches. By the time you get to Wisconsin, it's almost 40 inches. So Wisconsin is actually sufficient enough rainfall that we're dominated by forests. But as you continue further west, those stresses then leave the forest behind and the grasslands have dominated. So what we've always called the Great Plains or the prairies, this is that North American grassland, a counterpart to other grasslands around the world. So it was these extensive plains that were essentially a barrier to a lot of the exploration and advancement of people across the central portion of the continent, and yet were also the rich grazelands and habitat for so much of our North American wildlife. The bison are certainly the icon for a lot of this, as well as the pronghorn antelope. Wisconsin, at the time of settlement, was also heavily dominated by prairie, the yellow that we see particularly in the south and southwestern part of the state. The vast majority was prairie, but this was maintained as a fire-dominated community. In other words, forest would have dominated because of the amount of moisture we have. The prairies were found more to the west of us because of the stresses of lack of moisture, but they were extending far into the Midwest by essentially burning back that forest, holding it back, and converting it then and maintaining the grassland. So while grasslands are natural in the central portion of the United States, in Wisconsin it was a fire-dominated community. So it allowed it to expand a little bit farther beyond that climatic barrier for it. Here's a map indicating what were some of the large major prairies found in Wisconsin at the time of settlement. A lot of the area in between that was essentially savanna, which would have then been a prairie understory with scattered oaks being fire resistant. A transition zone there from true grassland to dense forest. Some of the remaining remnants we find today, Chilwaukee Prairie, is just a postage stamp of what one time was an expansive prairie in southwestern Wisconsin. The Avoca Bottoms along the Wisconsin River is another larger prairie that we find. But even these are just a small remnant of one time the expansive grasslands that dominated Wisconsin. What happened to the prairies? Well, what we find is that when the settlers arrived originally in the Midwest, the philosophy was that an area that was so poor that it wouldn't support trees probably wouldn't support agriculture. So they went into the hardwood forest, cut down the trees, burned the stumps, converted a forest soil for agriculture. And so it really appeared to them as if the prairie was sort of a barren desert that was not suitable for land use. It wasn't until about the 1850s, with the invention of the steel and moldboard plow, we're able to slice through that dense sod and reveal one of the richest soils in North America. In our woodland areas, average topsoil is about 2 to 6 inches. In most of our prairies, it's about 3 to 6 feet, and in some places with the wind-blown silts that have accumulated, it may be as much as 20 feet of topsoil. So these were extremely rich soils, and it really took that invention to be able to slice through that dense root mass to be able to take advantage of the rich soils. And so while we refer to that whole central portion of the United States as the Great Plains or the prairies of North America, another name more recently had been given to it as the breadbasket of the world. It became the corn belt and wheat belt of North America. And so in a sense, the prairies that gave us some of these richest soils also led to their demise. Now for a while, agriculture was really quite compatible with quite a few of our birds. Grazing of cattle was something that really didn't destroy the grassland community. Yes, there may have been overstocking concerns where the grasses were just simply too short to provide sufficient nesting habitat, but you have to keep in mind that the bison had always grazed on the prairies as well. And so with some compatible types of stocking rates and with the grazing of cattle, we find what we really had then was a compatibility of the advent of modern agriculture and also maintaining sufficient grassland bird habitat. So what we find also is that from the 1940s to the 1960s, as we were keeping bird surveys, particularly game bird surveys, we saw a great increase in our waterfowl population at that time and a recovery from the market hunting days and overharvest of ducks that took place in the late 1800s and 1920s. So we actually saw at that point that those populations, right along with the introduced pheasants, were doing quite well. And it was after the 1960s with large-scale modern farming where we started to see those populations plummet. We no longer had a compatible situation with the needs of wildlife and the practices of modern agriculture. Bobolinks is a bird that is certainly well tied to our grasslands. And when I worked at Horicon, I would hear from the farmers and the rural folk in the area. They would tell me time and again, I still remember that the bobolinks and meadowlarks were so abundant. And those people would see them as a common bird in the area. And they also noticed, even if they weren't biologists or bird watchers themselves, that these were birds that were just no longer as abundant as they used to be. What happened for the bobolink is it's a grassland bird. They don't need really tall, dense grasses, but sort of a moderate type of grass cover. And they were able to adapt not just to pasture land, but also to the haylands. And the haylands are what biologists oftentimes refer to as surrogate grasslands. In other words, they are not the native prairie. They're not constituted of the original prairie grasses. They may be timothy, brome, and alfalfa, or even the clovers. But it's the structure, the height, that provided really good cover that served as well as the original prairie. The birds were drawn to structure, as we refer to it. That growth form and density of the plant material. What happened more recently is that farmers found that the clover crops were really productive for the cattle, particularly in springtime, to convert over to a little bit more protein. And the problem with our clovers is that the very first cutting happens usually right around Memorial Day. The bobolink is a very long distance migrant. They're actually traveling between two grasslands. They nest in the southwestern savanna areas of the United States, and particularly across the grasslands and agriculture areas in the north central and even into the northeastern United States. As a grassland bird, they're not able to really survive in the climate along the Gulf Coast, so they need to fly to South America. The problem, as soon as you hit South America, you reach tropical rainforests. And they actually have to fly over the entire Amazon basin before they reach the next grassland, which is the Argentine pampas. So for a songbird, a member of the blackbird family, our bobolink is making a trip of about 6,000 to 8,000 miles each way. So they're a late migrant to arrive here. They've got a long flight. They want to wait until our climate is, well, obviously, as we see today, stable and productive for a nesting season. They'll arrive as we get into the first 10 days of May. They'll establish a territory, look for a mate, begin to set up nesting, and just as they initiate the nesting, that's when the mowing begins. And so what we end up with is the clover fields, or what we refer to as an ecological sink. And for those not familiar with those terms, what we mean by an ecological sink is that the clover fields are attractive. They're like a magnet. The birds are drawn to it. It provides the character and the look of what they've always needed. Nature has tuned them in to search for that, but unfortunately they're not producing young to even replace their own numbers. And so as natural mortality is removing birds, they're not then reproducing successfully in those environments to be able to replace themselves. So essentially numbers tend to go down. And in landscape ecology, the large dynamics you want to look for is where you have enough of these sinks, where you have negative reproduction. To offset that, you have to have areas that are extremely productive, which are going to be with a positive reproduction, what we refer to as a source. You need to have areas where they are nesting successfully so that those birds that are no longer able to find a territory there spread out, and they may go into a sink. And with that, hopefully we maintain some sort of a balance. And so the clover fields have become a big sink for these birds, and that's really led to the demise of many of our grassland songbirds over the years. As I mentioned, pasturing of cattle can be quite compatible with the needs of our grassland birds and can provide sufficient habitat. When we completely convert it to row crops, there's nothing left for habitat. In fact, probably the only bird that can actually nest in row crops is the horned lark. Not in large numbers, but it's the only species that we know of that we've ever documented nesting somewhat successfully in, say, cornfields. And so this is what happened to the prairies. In this picture I actually took in wintertime, which was in the heart of one of the largest prairies in Wisconsin from the time of settlement. So again, it was that gift of the prairies to give us the rich topsoil, but unfortunately it also led to its own decline. Here we find a nice mixture between clover, pasture, or hayfields, and the cornfields. So these kinds of farming practices can support certain populations of some of our grassland songbirds. In areas like this, the meadowlarks, and also the savanna sparrow and vesper sparrows, they can certainly persist. So we do find that there are ways that we can use the land and still provide habitat that the birds have always depended on. This is a crop field right above Horicon Marsh where I worked. This is an area that was in corn, same crop for at least 10 or 12 years in a row. It was literally hundreds of acres. And you can also see what's happening to the topsoil here. We're not only losing then the bird habitat, but over time we're losing the productivity of that land. So with the frost still in the ground at that time of year and the spring rains coming, like right now, you can see the fine topsoil is being washed into the ditch, and unfortunately for where I worked, it's also going into the creeks and into the marsh. It didn't benefit the farmer, and the uplands, it didn't benefit the wetland either that's on the receiving end of things. So these are obviously not sustainable practices, not sustainable for humans nor the wildlife that always depended on these very landscapes. We also find right around Horicon Marsh, like so many other places, that we're losing farmland. So we're losing the farmland as conversion to housing. And here again, we're finding that where farmland is at least malleable, you can do something with it. We can put it into CRP, we can change the practices, and with that, we can always reverse some of those changes. Once you put a house on there, it gets much more difficult. How would you ever be able to buy all that up and plow it under and bulldoze it away in order to convert the wildlife habitat? It's not going to happen. So these are much more permanent conversions to the land that are affecting wildlife, slowly kind of creeping along like a glacier. Here's our little clay-colored sparrow, one of our grassland birds. They use the thickets along the edges of the prairie and wide open areas. Like so many others, these are birds that are dependent on that very habitat. And even our northern harriers are birds that are birds of prey but nest in grasslands. What we found with northern harriers is that we were considering in the 1980s for listing as a threatened species in Wisconsin and in many other places across the Midwest. Populations were declining quite significantly. 1985, we had the initiation of the CRP Conservation Reserve Program, which was a set-aside to pay farmers for long-term establishment of permanent grass cover, and not only to take the most erodible soils out of farming, but also put it into wildlife habitat. And we saw a positive response with over 40 million acres of conservation reserve land enrolled into the federal farm bill, with a response of so many of our grassland birds. Northern harrier numbers responded, and I could see it myself. They were starting to be much more visible and much more prominent on the landscape again. Meadowlarks also, and some of our grassland birds. And the grasslands are not only important for summer nesting, but also wintering sites. These are lapwing longspurs that come down from the Arctic that use our farm fields in the wintertime. I should digress for just a second here. When we talk about grasslands, there's a lot of different kinds of grasslands, not only the short grass, mixed and tall grass prairies, but along with that, the types of structure and growth which are attractive habitat for different kinds of birds. I already mentioned that the bobolink is looking for something of a medium height and density, which is why that clover field is so attractive. We find some birds use very sparse types of grasslands. Even heavily grazed areas can be very attractive too. The vesper sparrow, savanna sparrow, they like something that's a little bit more open as a type of a grassland structure to it. However, if you want to attract something like the Henslow's and grasshopper sparrow, they need really tall, dense grasses. So when I've established prairie stands, it isn't until at least 3 or 4 years that the grasses grow nice and tall where those birds start to move in. So when we talk grasslands, it's not just one type of a habitat. There are many types of heights and growth and density and different kinds of structure within that. And the important thing to keep in mind here is what's really attracting these birds is not the grasses themselves, but it's the structure. It's the way these grasses are standing that is really the key for them to utilize them. Interesting study that was done on the white-throated sparrow back in the 1940s was looking at what sort of cues were these birds looking for as shelter and potential nesting space. And if anybody knows our white-throated sparrows, they'll be here probably within a week. And where do you find them? Under the trees, in the thickets. They're really in the heavy bushes. So the experiment they did with a white-throated sparrow is they just took little sticks, like chopsticks. They placed them all straight up and down and left the bird there, and they moved in and out. Didn't really seem to be particularly interested in it as a place to hide. They had them also vertically, as well as horizontally placed, and either way, the birds didn't seem to make much of a unique selection of that. But as soon as they randomly crisscrossed them into like almost a tangle, it was like a magnet. They were drawn to that. So it is structure that the birds are looking for. And in other words, it doesn't really matter if it's a short grass prairie or if it's an alfalfa field. It's that structure. It also doesn't matter then if it's a native grass, such as little bluestem, or whether it's timothy and brome. Either one of those provide that needed structure. We also find that there are some grasses that don't provide the actual structure that birds need. And a good example of that is reed canary grass. That is too rank, too thick, and it's also very soft. The birds just don't seem to be attracted to it and can't move through it. And so these don't provide really the kind of a desirable habitat quality for them. So that's really the key here, is that the birds are looking for then not a particular type of grass, but the structure that they provide. Its height, its density. And also what I find is that in my experiments over the decades of trying to plant prairies, we did a very large one early on back in the mid-'80s in the northern Kettle Moraine, several hundred acres. And it was at a time when DNR was still doing what we call dense nesting cover. It was mostly just switchgrass. We thought if we plant enough switchgrass, the ducks and the pheasants will use it, maybe some songbirds. Put it next to a wetland, the ducks will have their brood cover and also some nesting space nearby. But it seemed that the songbirds were not that particularly attracted to dense stands of switchgrass. It was too monotypic, and it only provided a very uniform type of a height and structure to it. So what I did is we mixed the variety of grasses, and we went to remnant sites and collected the wildflower seeds from that. We put that in with the whole mixture and created sort of a recreation of a prairie assemblage there of both the forbs, the wildflowers, and the grasses. Within 3 years, we had both Henslow's and grasshopper sparrows, the bobolinks moved in, the meadowlarks were there, and we attracted actually a whole community of grassland birds. What I think the forbs did for it was a couple of things. First of all, the grasses may be a nice area to find a dense place to hide a nest, but it's limited food. There's very few insects that will forage on grasses. You take a look at some grass blades, there aren't a lot of things that eat it. Take a look at the wildflowers, what's all munching away. The monarchs are chomping on the milkweed. Other kinds of insects are eating on the different leaves of the wildflowers. Also keep in mind that your grasses are wind pollinated. They don't need insects. Your wildflowers are insect pollinated. So you have the pollinators, you have the foragers on there, and then of course when those wildflowers mature, you also have the seeds. The other thing that those wildflowers do is they provide what I've referred to as a micro edge effect. In other words, you get dense grasses and then something that breaks it up in between. And I don't know if everyone's familiar with what we've referred to as the edge effect. But the edge effect is simply was very early on recognized as kind of an important factor in managing game and even some non-game species, and that is where the forest and fields meet. So you have your highest density of wildlife right on that edge. because the forest birds meet their outer edge, the grassland birds meet there, and then in the thickets you have a whole nother community such as white-throated sparrows, cardinals, and your catbirds that are looking for the shrubbery. So those are some really important types of factors. Well, in a prairie, if you got down right on your hands and knees, I think you would see the same thing as a micro edge. In other words, the bunch grasses, and then breaking that up, little clusters and open areas where the birds can move between along with the rodents, and then also you've got places for escape as well as for feeding. And the last thing that the forbs did is where the grasses do not provide necessarily the most attractive seeds, except in wintertime, say for the tree sparrows, they also provide the singing perches. Birds have a hard time sitting on a grass that keeps falling down to get a good singing perch. Perch yourself on top of an old silphium or say a rigid goldenrod, that's the singing perch on an open grassland. And that also then implies one other important thing, that as we utilize these grasslands throughout the year, what the birds are nesting in is the dead stuff from the previous year's growth, what we refer to as the residual cover. And so this then is really what we need to manage for grassland birds, is a variety in terms of height and structure, in terms of the composition, the types of plants that make that up, and the different types of grassland communities that provide for the needs of the various kinds of birds that have evolved with those and depend on short grass, tall grass, and everything in between. Well, the North American prairies are certainly under pressure, and so are other grasslands around the world. On the Argentine pampas, I think a lot of people know that Argentine beef is big. Beef is a big industry down there, and we're also finding that stocking rates have increased in some areas, and in fact the saffron-headed blackbird is now on their endangered list. There's a very intensive effort to survey these populations and try to come up with a national recovery program. And so with that, again, the pampas have provided at one time not only important wildlife habitat for South America as the prairies did here, but we're also seeing the changes in the use of those areas are affecting wildlife negatively, though with better understanding and some concerted efforts, we could reverse that. In Mongolia, same way. We're seeing an increasing human population. These people have always been nomadic, but they're starting to increase the size of their herds. And it is not only the animals that they use for food, but horses is a status symbol. And so the more horses that you have tends to show a little bit of your wealth and stature. And so some of these horse herds, along with the sheep, the cattle, camels, and others, are starting to increase. And we're seeing that as these families are moving around nomadically, unfortunately somebody else is moving in about as fast as that grass is growing. And so with that, we're starting to see a little bit more damage to the grass cover, not as much recovery of its height. And of course, the result of overgrazing is once you lose that sod, the wind and the rain now removes the topsoil. Once that's gone, your grasses have less chance of recovering to the density they were before. Oh, and by the way, that last picture, I'll just go back one, what they were doing is milking the horses. Not my favorite thing was fermented horse's milk. I rock. Sheep have become quite big there, and what we're finding in some of these grassland areas, because of the world demand for cashmere, now goats are being brought in on top of that. And so they oftentimes lead to even more intensive grazing pressure on some of these, especially marginal grasslands. Africa, right now, the grasslands tend to be quite intact in the large reserve areas, so certainly the Serengeti, Masai Mara, some of these are still supporting tremendous herds, but with a very large human population and one of the largest growth rates of human population in Africa, we're starting to see much more demand and encroachment on those areas. And it's a lot of this is very dry. These are semi-desert grasslands, and there again, increased human use and grazing pressure or conversion to farmland. What we see there is, again, the loss of that sod and the chance for erosion of the topsoils. What I think we need for any of these grasslands to increase a public awareness and appreciation for them is an icon that people can relate to. And I think there are a few outstanding wildlife examples around the world that I think that people can see as that icon of the grasslands around the world. One of my favorites is the Cory bustard of Africa, the male displaying here. This is a very large bird. It's not necessarily recognized by everybody, but certainly to me is quite iconic. I suppose the one that maybe if people understand a little bit more or relate to would be the secretary bird. And this would be kind of that emblem of the African grasslands. In South America, maybe it's the rhea, a close relative to the ostriches in Africa. Or if you're looking for something a little more colorful, the brown and yellow blackbird, or what I find really striking is the scarlet-headed blackbird, kind of a counterpart to our yellow-headed blackbird. In Wisconsin, in North America, the bison has always been really the icon of the great grasslands. One of my favorites is the grasshopper sparrow. I enjoy these birds. They're a real specialist for the grassland habitat. I don't know if it would lure a lot of people if we had a grasshopper sparrow festival. I don't think we'd get quite a big turnout, but I think for those people who really enjoy wildlife and especially grassland birds, this is one to always search for. And I think this is where the prairie chicken comes in for us. The prairie chicken really is our icon for the grasslands. It is our ambassador species. It is something that stands for grasslands and their importance. It's something that people can relate to. It has an attractiveness. On top of that is what we refer to as the umbrella species. If we can care enough about prairie chickens, and we get people who be interested in prairie chickens and wanting to preserve them, we then find it essential to preserve that grassland habitat, not only for them, but for everything else that inhabits it. And I think that's really the significance of the prairie chicken and even our prairie chicken festival, is raising the awareness, not just of one bird, but their essential tie with that grassland community that was so dominant in North America, and is something that perhaps is so easily overlooked as well. So with that, I'll give you a little reflection here of our grassland habitats and the wildlife that inhabits them, some of the wonderful wildlife we find around the world. And I think while we may be intrigued with the pampas and the Serengeti, remember our grasslands are as important to the world as those other more exotic ones are perhaps to us. Thank you so much. Yes, I'd be glad to take any questions anybody has.
Please.
You bet.
So, I'm grazing right now about 400 acres. 76 acres of it is some DNR land that we're grazing. 30 of it is some wetland reserve land. With the DNR land and the wetland reserve land, that's a whole different monoculture than what I have on my high productive dairy grass land. But in that amount of land, how much of that monoculture could I try to create in certain areas on that to draw those bobbling? I have, the bobblings are deafening. There's people come out to try to hear the grasshopper sparrow and they can't hear the grasshopper sparrow because of the bobblings. And we have an abundance of meadowlarks, which you can hear them sing now. Even.
Do you also have western meadowlarks?
I have had people identify a few,
Yep.
but that's very early in the season.
Yep.
Most of our meadowlarks are the eastern.
Right.
Right. But my question is how could I create certain areas that would, because I try to mow late, and I try not to clip my pastures either.
Right.
So in that sense, I do have a lot of that taller grass that, the cattle don't, totally graze off.
Well, I guess just a quick off-the-cuff response would be, first of all, you want to have some diversity in your structure of how much of that grass and height you leave going into the fall and what is available for the next year. So with your rotations, with your stocking rates, and maybe the types of grass that you have, you can create a little bit of a mosaic and difference within that structure. I think the best way to evaluate your success is get yourself a good field guide, get to know the birds, and let them tell you. Take a look at where your bobolinks are going to be really dense and perhaps where they're not. Or in contrast, as I said earlier, birds such as savanna sparrows and field sparrows, and as well as the vesper sparrows, they're using the shorter stuff. See where you're finding that you can have a little more intensive stocking and yet find that those birds are using those fields very successfully. It's always going to be the proof of just what are the birds going to be using.
When we start out in the spring, I usually don't come back to that spot for 35 to 40 days.
Right.
So across the whole farm, you know, I do have a lot of different heights, you know, from down to that 3-4 inches to
Right.
to.
And you've got
10,
really
12.
you've got two challenges. One of them, as you said, you don't want to mow too early, which means you're not then cutting the grass during the height of the nesting season. So that's really important. But then on the other end, you want to make sure that you have sufficient grasses remaining as you're going into the winter.
Right.
And so there again, you want to find a bit of a balance. It's kind of like, say, starting a good prairie fire. We know that if we want to maintain prairies in Wisconsin, we need to burn them. But we also find if we burn the whole thing off at once, we've got no cover the next year. This was very vivid in the Kettle Moraine on the project I worked at. We had a grass field doing extremely well. It came up in some good height, and then it was time to burn it. They burned half of the entire thing. And what we found was that all of the grasshopper sparrows, Henslow sparrows, they moved to what was unburned. And conversely, I found a big increase, which were never in that rank grass, of field sparrows and the savanna sparrows. They liked the open. They moved into it because it was burned. And we also know, of course, that'll affect the overwintering invertebrate population as well. But it's the amount of structure you leave for the next growing season. So I would experiment a little bit. Take a look at that, your stocking rates, and even the grasses that you have and the kind of structure they're leaving there. And as you go into the spring, what's available? What's your kind of a diversity in structure, and see where the birds are at. And maybe if you want to take some of your units and just have someone go out and just take a little notes of that, and let the birds tell you what is the most desirable for it. My real concern about farming these days is we used to take the cattle and put them out into the pasture, and we maintained some grassland out there, even if some of this may have been at times a bit overgrazed. And nowadays, we cut everything off and we take the grass to the cows. And we realize that's not in favor of the birds. That's why we're seeing so many of the grassland bird populations declining in North America.
In comparison to what my father did, I was born and raised on this farm. You know, they gave the cows 40 acres, and that was their pasture for the
Right.
year. But, you know, now that I rotate, you know, I try to leave that different types of height around.
And of course, back then, it's a different era. It was also the fact, I think, that the average farm field was about 40 to 80 acres because of the limited machinery and ownership. Now you've got people who've got under the plow literally thousands of acres and going into monoculture. So we're creating some very large wildlife deserts out there too from intensive types of use. Yeah, John.
Lisa is here, but I'm curious where we are relative to the long-term picture it was in the 1930s with the prairie grouse, particularly the prairie chicken. And then I've got a couple other things. One is we have quite a lot of fallow land that's not tilled in parts of the state, and I'm curious how you might consider that to be. What's the wildlife habitat for that? When you go to eastern Wisconsin, you've got phragmites, which is a very tall, woody type grass, and we've got bowgrass in the wetlands. I'm curious about what you think about those odd species that are here in the landscape. But first, where are we at with chickens?
Well, prairie chickens, I think, as you know real well, it was 1933, and that was cited by Hammerstrom's, and it was also mentioned by Wallace Grange, that at that time we found prairie chickens in every county in the state. We had logged off northern Wisconsin, we had the big fires, and that was converted actually to open land. So there was no concern about the prairie chickens because they had just expanded beyond their normal range. And then we started to see the regrowth of the forest, the contraction of that range, and the more intensive use of farmland, which had more or less restricted them to this little area in central Wisconsin. I remember the wildlife managers I worked with down in Horicon, they said they remembered into the late 1950s and early 60s, there were still prairie chickens in Fond du Lac and Dodge County. And they also mentioned to me, it wasn't just the pasture land, upland and grassland that was important, but just like for pheasants, it was the isolated little wetlands as winter shelter. Those as well were extremely important as a mosaic. So we tiled and tried to drain the wetlands, we plowed everything around it, we got rid of the hedgerows and the escape routes, and with that, it just became too monotypic. The pressure became too much. The problem for the grouse now is there was also a model done, this was for sharp-tailed grouse, Stan Temple and others worked on what was the necessary amount of land needed for a minimum viable population of sharp-tailed grouse in Wisconsin. And the way he estimated it was the size of your lek, the number of males, you've got the dominant male breeding with it, how much genetic exchange do you have within there, and the types of areas you needed then for nesting. And doing the calculations, he figured that absolute minimum to keep a population going with enough genetic diversity. So we refer to as a minimum viable population. In other words, maintaining 95% of the genetic diversity within an isolated population, no less than 10,000 acres of contiguous grassland. That may actually even be an underestimate. We may also find that maybe the original scatter pattern that Hammerstrom's had proposed and worked on, that may have worked when we had the small-scale farming around there, but with the intensification, that alone may not be enough. And that's probably why we're seeing some of the problems of the inbreeding here, and with all the efforts we've done of trying to introduce some genetic diversity in other birds, the challenges of trying to maintain it, and then the isolation of the Leola population from the central populations here. Again, as you had asked about what's going to work best in agriculture, birds will tell you. And something is telling us that what we're doing is still not sufficient enough, perhaps, to maintain that population in central Wisconsin in the long run.
But I am encouraged. I am starting to hear the drumming of the grouse now. And I've heard it in 2 different areas. So that's encouraging that there must be little areas that they're there, or...
Well, they're
you
probably
think
drawn
just-
because you've got ideal habitat, and maybe if a neighbor here or someone else there. The big question is on a larger landscape scale, are there enough of those to keep a sufficient population going with enough genetic interchange so that, say, over the next 100 years, that population maintains itself? Recent evidence is showing us that we continue to see a decline among this population, and maybe it just isn't sufficient at this point.
But I'm 400 acres right in the middle of the Paul J. Olson Wildlife Area, and sure, the Paul J. Olson Wildlife Area is scattered.
Right.
But I think it amounts to about 3,000 acres right now. I think, is that an accurate number? The people that should know that. Sharon, Paul J. Olson is about 3,000 acres? Right. Lisa Kardash is here. She's our biologist there.
But again, for sharp-tailed grouse, they said 10,000 minimum.
Yeah.
And so this becomes a challenge, especially as you have more people and more pressure on the land to set aside large enough of an areas for some of these, especially birds that require vast areas. I mean, remember, the prairie chicken grew up on something that covered 1/3 of the continent. We're down to postage stamps, but yet that's our icon.
Jeff, one thing I forgot to mention, 1972, we had prairie chickens east of Pittsburgh, over 13. We had prairie chickens in our backyard, in West Rapids. We had prairie chickens on the Sand Hill Wildlife in the middle of nowhere, a big marsh, wetland marsh.
Right.
That's 72, that's it. I mean, they're pretty much gone, they're obviously gone. And we had quite large flocks in the town of Seneca, in the marsh country, and the cranberry country.
Yep.
So that's
Well, I would look at it this way. I mean, was it that the farming mosaic at the time was still compatible? They were using the wildlife areas and the surrounding private land, and that was enough? Or were we really seeing the last relic population that was pushed into those areas, the last stronghold, and it wasn't enough over time, and eventually it just petered out? And I would probably lean toward the second, that was the last of the good habitat, and they used it for as long as they could, but again, it was a sink. They couldn't maintain a sufficient amount of reproduction to keep it going on the land available. But those are the challenges. And again, if we're going to do anything for grassland birds and grassland habitat, I think we've got a real gem in the prairie chicken. And if we can do enough for prairie chickens and learn what they need, I think that they become that umbrella to care for an awful lot of other species that have very much the same needs. Well, I'll be around for a good part of the day, and I'll be glad to answer any more questions. Well, I'll take one more here.
I've had prairie chickens all my life. I've seen the biggest flock and the most prairie chicken boom in this county and Wood County. All of a sudden, bang, they're gone. There's pictures of them on that table. I studied those birds since I was 10 years old. I'm 83 now. I seen the habitat change just a little. But what happens is the prairie chicken were neglected. went to work and flooded the wetlands areas where the prairie chicken lived. And that was it. Prairie chickens are gone because of stupidity to flood the land that the prairie chickens lived on.
Well, you have the same thing. You either flood it or you plow it. One way or another, the habitat is no longer there for them.
But that could be drained out back where it was instead of making wetlands
Right.
out of the prairie chicken's habitat.
Well, as I said
And
earlier,
one more thing.
Yeah.
The farmers spread this liquid manure. Somebody ought to catch up with them. They've got 2 tanks. They got one with the liquid manure and one with the acids. They spread, I rented my farm 1 year. They spread the acids on my farm. They spread the manure on his farm. It killed all of the earthworms that are on that ground. So, what did the prairie chickens do? Boom, they went. They didn't have no night crawlers anymore.
well, I'll conclude with this. I've always mentioned to people at Horicon Marsh, the many audiences I had, is if we look at the land, wildlife is a product of it. It's like a crop. And it's that wildlife that'll tell us about the quality of the land. If the land is sufficient and providing what they need, we'll see those populations maintain themselves. And so that's really becomes our barometer of how we measure how we're using the land and how we're living with the land. And if we can't live with the land that also provides the habitat where the wildlife is finding what they need, I think we're in real trouble. Because what would this world be if we didn't have the birds out there, if we couldn't see a prairie chicken? And as I've been telling people, I've been fortunate enough to be able to travel and see a lot of the world's birds. I hope to see a lot more of them, but I would be absolutely remiss for any of the thousands of birds I've seen to think at some point that they're no longer there and that opportunity is no longer available for anyone. And I don't care where in the world. And I think the only place while we can travel and see exotic wildlife, we still are the stewards of the land right here. And this is the only place that we have responsibility for. And so with that, we certainly need to encourage more and more people to look at the land as really the foundation for both our own sustenance and sustainability of our wildlife. And the wildlife will tell us whether we're doing right or not. Thanks.